Throughout history, man has been forced to protect himself from predators, both animal and human, and has himself become predatory, preying on animals for food and humans for conquest. This activity created the need for weapons. From the time of the Bronze Age until the advent of firearms, the sword was a primary offensive and defensive weapon, and many legends are built on historical heroes and their prowess with the sword. Some swords, like the fabled Excalibur, the sword in the stone, became legends in their own right. The sword has become such an integral part of our culture that even today, centuries after the advent of firearms, the fascination with swords and swordsmanship continues unabated. It is certain that no other weapon's reputation will ever replace the romance and splendor of the sword. Man's history is tied irrevocably to his harnessing of energy and minerals. The discovery of the ore smelting process and the development of the charcoal furnace led to the earliest cast bronze swords. The height of the Bronze Age saw the production of weapons such as King Gojen's sword, which was not only functional but beautifully made. The advent of steel was undoubtedly one of the most significant events in man's history, and its effect on the development of weaponry was striking. Swordsmiths, both Eastern and Western, were at the forefront in developing weapons-grade steel. As the sword became a portable and efficient means of defense, as well as a status symbol, political leaders aspired to own the best, regardless of cost. The best sword makers and metalsmiths were provided with the best materials available, resulting in the creation of superbly crafted and decorated weapons, many of which survive to this day. With the invention and development of firearms, the sword, along with plate armor, began to play less and less a role in warfare, though the cavalry sword lived on well into the 19th century. The sword's use as a personal defense and dueling weapon continued into the 18th century, when its role started to change as the sport of fencing developed. In the 20th century, enthusiasm for the sword faded, and apart from its use in fencing and certain martial arts, little attention was paid to recreating either its history or its symbolism. Only a relatively small cadre of collectors and sword lovers were able to appreciate the hidden history of an antique sword, where it was created, when and where it fought, and who were its heroes and its villains. Until almost the end of the century, very few authentically replicated swords were available to the general public. Certainly, swords for the fencer were available, and the martial artist could buy a sword at a price, but the starting collector on a budget had access only to decorator pieces that bore little resemblance to the highly functional works of the old-time smiths. But a demand will always create a supply, and the rebirth of the sword was beginning. Paul Chun, as a sword collector in his native Taipei, found himself frustrated with the high prices of antique swords and the impossibility of finding quality reproductions. His passion for the sword could not be fulfilled by the limited numbers of affordable pieces in the marketplace. So he decided to remedy the situation for himself and other collectors in the same situation. In 1990, Paul toured China, looking for a suitable location to make quality swords, and found conditions to be ideal in Dalian, a station of industry by the sea. Dalian had the materials, the steelworking skills, and the technological resources needed for forging blades to his exacting standards. Paul quickly formed a team under the name of Hanwei to produce the quality swords. This team is still at the core of Hanwei's management and has earned the respect and support of many museums, researchers, and sword historians. Today, Hanwei stands at the forefront of organizations dedicated to providing quality swords at an affordable price to a discerning public. Chinese swords began life in the Bronze Age. The design fundamentals established at that time predominated for more than 1,000 years. The symmetry of the blade is key, with equal distribution about the median ridge, symbolizing perfect balance about the golden mean. With the introduction to China of iron smelting and forging techniques, the development of the sword progressed rapidly, culminating in the evolution of heating and cooling techniques for combining iron and carbon to form the most important metal known to man, steel. Sword quality and steel quality progressed hand in hand as advances in heat treatment and forging technology materialized. In simple terms, forging is the process of deforming by impact in a controlled way steel that has been heated to a plastic state. To early smiths, forging was a way of making a usable shape from an iron billet. Today, it is also a way of improving steel's uniformity, aligning grain boundaries to promote strength and toughness, increasing density and removing impurities. In combination with exact heat treatment, the steel's hardness and flexibility are also optimized. Damascus, folded or pattern welded steel, is formed by combining billets of 2 or more steels of differing carbon contents. Billets of other metals, such as nickel, may also be combined with the steel. The billets are stacked and forge welded together, and then forged repeatedly while folding, twisting, and sometimes punching the resulting mass in a predetermined manner to achieve the required pattern. Folded steel has the advantage that by combining the appropriate steels, the optimal qualities of each of the components in terms of flexibility, hardness, and toughness, as well as some outstanding patterns, can be achieved in the final product. The patterning of the steel, as displayed on the surface of the blade after polishing, is determined by the skill and artistry of the forger. Famous Chinese swords in history, such as the Yuchang, fishbelly, and Songwen pine-grade swords, were so named for their blade patterning and are not specific pieces, but rather classes of sword exhibiting these blade patterns. In China, the forging of pattern-welded steel is regarded as an art form. Today, the steel is often referred to as Damascus, but in China, it is called multiple refined steel. Cao Cao in the Three Kingdoms period used the good yang of multiple refined steel to destroy the evil yin, so in history the Chinese nobility regarded such steel as a treasure. Hanwei has been researching and developing Damascus steel for many years so that the traditional techniques can be passed on to future generations. The quality of the Chinese sword is judged by its symmetry about the center line of the blade. Each component has its given function, with priority given to firmness, sharpness, and handling qualities. The function of the guard has its emphasis on preventing the hands of the user from slipping onto the blade, rather than protecting the hands from the sword of the opponent. For producing the fittings for Chinese swords, Hanwei employs the lost wax or investment casting process, which was developed in China many centuries ago. A hard wax model of the part is first made. Then it is coated with several coats of a ceramic slurry to form a hard shell around the wax. The wax is then removed by heating, leaving the shell as a mold into which molten metal is poured. The mold is then broken away from the metal part so formed, and some minor surface work results in the finished fitting. This particular example is poured in brass, but bronze, iron, and stainless steel fittings are also produced in the same way and are often finished by plating. This process produces high-strength hilt and scabbard components in contrast to the inferior fittings that are commonplace on lower quality swords. The scabbard of a sword both protects the sharp edges of the blade and enables it to be carried safely. If the scabbard is made of a hard wood, such as rosewood, the inside will be lined with a softer wood to prevent damage to the blade. Today we use both traditional and modern materials and techniques in making our Chinese sword scabbards, depending on the sword's application. Traditional techniques include covering a scabbard with ray skin, a very tough material requiring great skill and artistry. The scabbard of the Ming Qilin sword in itself is a work of art. It has a soft wood liner, first covered with thin, transparent strips of buffalo horn, and then mounted in an attractive but sturdy metal frame, which provides excellent protection. For some of our Chinese martial arts swords, we have developed fiberglass scabbards, which have the advantages of being both light and strong. The original function of the sword tassel was to prevent the loss of the sword during frenzied cavalry engagements. The tassel typically tied the sword to the wrist. Today, the tassel is often used to improve the balance of a sword during martial arts activities. The strongly Chinese styling of the tassel has become well known in its own right. The Qi sword's name originates with the Qi nation, one of the many warring states that eventually formed modern China. Legend has it that Feng Xuan, one of the Qi people, used the ringing sound of his one-piece sword to seal his relationship with Meng Changjun. This precious sword then became known as a Qi sword. The whole sword, from pommel to tip, is forged from a single billet of steel. It is a sword of unparalleled strength and balance. The sword emits a clear bell-like tone when lightly struck. We have to marvel at the fact that a craftsman could produce such a sword 1,000 years ago. The idea to make such a sword originated when Hanwei received an original Qi sword for restoration. Many development hours later, the first Qi sword produced in centuries was introduced to the world, bringing with it a spirit of Renaissance in Chinese culture and a splendid insight into China's history. The ringing of the sword instills a sense of pride in the people of Hanwei and provides encouragement to draw on the past to create a bright future. Early Japanese swords were based on straight-bladed styles originating in China or Korea, but legend has it that the first true samurai swords were produced around 700 AD, and by 900 AD had developed the form that we would recognize today. The swords produced by the Japanese smiths over the past 1,000 years are deservedly regarded as the pinnacle of the swordmaker's art. While greatly admiring and in some cases emulating the traditional techniques of the great Japanese smiths, the availability of modern steels and requirements for safety and efficiency have caused Hanwei to strive for a balance between traditional and modern forging methods. Hanwei's range of samurai swords employs several different steels, depending on the sword's application. A number of blades are made in the traditional way by selecting material from the kara and heating with charcoal during the forging process. Core steel and skin steel are selected for their carbon content, and each is stacked and folded multiple times to eliminate impurities and provide an even dispersion of carbides in the billet. The skin steel and core steel are then welded together and forged into a blade. Other folded steel blades are made by combining two modern high-carbon steels that again are folded together multiple times before being forged into a blade. Monosteel blades are forged from a billet of modern high-carbon steel specially selected for its functionality in a heat-treated state. After forging, the scale is removed and the blade is shaped roughly to the required dimensions. At this stage, the blade is still in the annealed, soft state, and the blade is straight. A special clay is then applied by hand to the blade using a thin covering near the edge and a thicker layer over the rest of the blade. The clay covering between the edge and the ridge line is sculpted at this point. And this process will determine the shape of the hamon or temper line. The blade with its clay covering is heated to a predetermined temperature and quenched in a water bath. The shape and continuity of the hamon, the sori or blade curvature, and blade straightness are all determined by the skill exercised in quenching. The sori is then adjusted, if necessary, to set the point of balance and the point of percussion. Blade geometry and surface finish are determined by the sword's intended function. Heavy cutting, fast cutting, multiple use, and iaido all require different geometry in terms of length, weight, balance, curvature, percussion point, and finish. All these factors must be taken into consideration from forging to final polishing. Weight and balance are key factors for any sword, as these, more than any other properties, affect the handling of the sword in relation to its application. The he, or groove, in a blade is often a most useful feature, as it can be used to adjust both weight and balance. Generally, the quality of a blade is judged by its degree of finish in terms of the definition of the shinogi or ridgeline, the kisaki, the hamon, and the ji. First impressions are important, and the skill and experience of a polisher is quickly revealed to the trained eye. If the blade is the soul of the samurai sword, the fittings are its lifeblood. Without the fittings, the blade would simply be a piece of inanimate art, maybe not a good thing for the forging smith or the polisher to hear, but nevertheless true. The combination of the blade and its fittings gives the sword functionality and purpose, and reveals the spiritual beauty of the Japanese sword. The typical Japanese long sword can be classed as either a tachi or a katana. Usually the armored samurai who fought on horseback would wield a tachi, while the katana was typically used for fighting on foot. Thus, the tachi evolved as a slashing weapon with a relatively large blade curvature, while the katana was straighter for ease of drawing and use in thrusting as well as slashing to meet the needs of the foot soldier. This is a typical samurai sword. Although hundreds of thematic variations occur, the basic style of its fittings in terms of both materials and structure has changed little over the course of centuries, thus making the sword uniquely Japanese and instantly recognizable. This is the tsuba, or guard. Apart from its obvious value as a hand protector, the tsuba invariably sets the decorative theme of the sword. This tsuba features a nanako, or stippled ground with metal inlays. This is called fuchi and kashira. Their theme followed the tsuba generally. These washers are called seppa. They are fitted on each side of the tsuba and vary in thickness so that the tsuka, or handle, is held tightly on the blade. Most of the tsuka of samurai swords are made of wood, covered in ray skin, with a rice paper liner, and then bound tightly with the tsuka ito, or handle wrap. The tsuka ito, which is traditionally made of cotton or silk, provides a secure grip and fixes the menuki at the desired position. There are many wrapping configurations, but this one is the most common. The tsuka is fixed to the tang of the blade by 1 or 2 mekugi, which are pegs made from bamboo. The menuki again is a themed decoration positioned on the tsuka so as to locate the hand in the optimum position. The saya, or scabbard, is made of 2 pieces of wood which are carefully fitted around the blade and then joined together by being wrapped in cambric. The cambric then receives many coats of lacquer and is polished repeatedly until a beautiful deep polished finish is attained. These pieces, the kurikata, koiguchi, and kojiri, are typically made from buffalo horn. The traditional sageo is made of silk and hand-braided, and patterns and scenes are often included in the weave. The sageo has 2 functions. It is used to bind the sleeves of the kimono during battle to keep them out of the way, and it is also used to secure the saya to the obi, or waist belt. The kurikata provides an attachment point on the saya for the sageo. The habaki provides a positive seat for the tsuba, as well as being the interface between the sword and the saya. The fit of the sword in the saya is important, as a loose fit can cause inadvertent loss of the sword from the scabbard, while too tight a fit will make drawing the sword difficult. As wood is a natural material subject to wear and climatic influences, the fit must be adjusted often. A loose fit is adjusted by gluing thin wood shims in the mouth of the saya, while a tight fit can be adjusted by careful filing of the inside of the mouth. Shorter swords, which had specific uses for the samurai, are the wakizashi, which is normally associated with the katana, and the tanto, which was often carried as an adjunct to the tachi. The cutting ability of a quality samurai sword in the hands of a skilled practitioner is second to none, due to the attention paid to blade geometry and edge hardness. Devotees of cutting with the sword, seeking to attain perfection, must develop a complex set of physical and mental skills that can only be properly learned from a master and retained by constant practice. The forging and construction of Japanese swords has become steeped in tradition, and attempted change is often considered as rebelling against perfection. However, the forces of progress must inevitably affect the methods of the past. We believe that further research involving modern materials and technology can result in improvements in perfection and an even wider adoption of the culture of the Japanese sword. Like the Chinese sword, the Western sword had its roots in the Bronze Age, and the early Celtic people in Central Europe had bronze swords as early as 1500 BC. The advent of iron smelting revolutionized the swordmaker's craft, and the Celts were making functional iron swords in the 7th century BC, often decorated in bronze and precious metals. After this, carbon steel was increasingly used and developed by the Celtic smiths. When the Romans started to expand their empire, they employed the gladius, a short, broad-bladed thrusting sword copied from the Iberian Celts. Their cavalry sword, the spatha, was also derived from a Celtic-style slashing sword with a longer, narrower blade than the gladius. With the decline of the Roman Empire, Europe entered the Dark Ages, and though little information from this period still exists, archaeological evidence has demonstrated that the spatha strongly influenced sword design. Advances in metallurgy allowed blades to become longer and stronger, and the Anglo-Saxon infantry and cavalry fought with double-edged, pattern-welded swords, some of which were exquisitely decorated. The Vikings greatly revered the sword and developed forging and pattern welding to an art form. Their blades, with hardened edges and grooves for weight reduction and balance, were tough and resilient. The hilts, which still bore some resemblance to those of the spatha, were made to enclose the fist tightly for complete control of the sword. The knightly sword of the Middle Ages evolved in response to the increasing use of defensive body armor. The cut-and-thrust blades had to be capable of both cleaving chainmail by slashing and of penetrating the joints of plate armor. The original of this sword, which has been preserved in fine condition, belonged to King Edward III, who ruled England in the 14th century. The excellent balance of the sword was achieved by forging the blade with a distal taper, whereby the blade not only tapers towards the point in width, but also in thickness. The Scots have a long history of warfare, and the prowess of their warriors with edged weapons has become legendary. Although basket-hilted swords were made and used all over Europe, they are invariably associated with the Scots. The fearsome claymore and similar two-handed swords like this were used to unseat mounted opponents. As the need for the sword as a military weapon was becoming marginalized with the advent of firearms, the light and quick rapier evolved as a civilian defense and dueling weapon. Dueling became pervasive in Western Europe, and school of fence proliferated to teach gentlemen how to prevail in a duel. Many valuable members of society were dying prematurely, and laws were passed either banning dueling completely or restricting the length of rapier blades. This helped to lead to the introduction of the court sword or small sword, which was both a gentlemanly defense weapon and a fashionable dress accessory. These rapiers demonstrate regional variations in rapier styling in Europe. The swept hilt rapier, such as this Gustav style, was preferred in the north of Europe, while the cup hilt style, like this Taza model, was popular in Spain and Italy. Today, fencing has become an international sport with a strong emphasis on safety, an appropriate precaution in view of its history. Time and temperature variation during the process of heating, quenching, and tempering a carbon steel sword blade causes the structure of the steel to change. It changes from pearlite to austenite to martensite and finally to tempered martensite. In this way, the blade acquires the appropriate hardness to maintain sharpness and the flexibility to absorb a shock. It is worth mentioning that we are developing applications for some very sophisticated blade steels, including the use of maraging steel for our sport fencing blades. This steel has some excellent properties for this application, particularly in regard to blade failure. We are also developing new steels for other important parts of our line. The original of this sword, housed in the Vienna Museum, is known as the Saber of Charlemagne and is part of the imperial insignia, though its exact origins are unclear. It is a beautifully made and decorated piece and was worn by successors of Charlemagne as part of their coronation regalia. This sword is a cavalry saber that possibly originated in Hungary or further east sometime during the early 10th century. The people of the Eurasian steppes were renowned as cavalrymen, and the curved blade, of which this is one of the earliest examples, remains a feature of many cavalry swords to this day. Given the region of this sword's creation at the junction of East and West, it is possible that it influenced sword design in both cultures, and it may be a connecting factor linking sword development in the East and the West. In the Western world, the word chivalry evokes a picture of an armored knight on horseback, invariably armed with a sword representing the spirit of courage, loyalty, and honor. In the 21st century, with the rapid development and spread of Western science and technology, the precise and scientific designing of traditional Western swords definitely needs the application of many arts and crafts in order to produce accurate replicas. Hanwei is happy to contribute to the passing down of this heritage. In relating to each other and nature, we learn from the sword maker who strives for perfection. As the sword maker must concentrate on achieving excellent balance in a sword, so we must establish balance in our relationships with each other and with nature. Sword making is a highly specialized skill. Sword culture is part of us and must be passed on so that it won't disappear. The sword has enriched our past. It also points the way to our future.